have not stepped aside, have not been charged, have not been removed from their positions. The infrastructure, the ICT infrastructure that was compromised, the Supreme Court say the ICT infrastructure was infiltrated by people who are not authorized.
Fine. So to sum it up, we're in a no better position now than we were in August after the elections happened, except that we have two senior election officials now saying they cannot guarantee the next election. So take us through what happens now.
Yes, but I think we are in a worse position than we were on August 8th. But this is what is going to happen. Sections of the country that are considered strongholds of the Jubilee Party will probably have some kind of an election. They will go to polling stations and they will vote. That is if Mr. Chebukati does not cancel the poll of October 26th. A large swath of the country, and here we are talking the former Nyanza province, the entire Nyanza province, 3/4 of Western province, almost the entire coast region, 3/4 of Nairobi County,
yes,
a large section of the Rift Valley will not vote because not only are those the strongholds of Mr. Raila Odinga, the governors of most of these counties have already stated that they are not going to allow an election in their county.
I mean, not only will they not vote, sir, but Raila Odinga himself, who's pulled out of the rerun, has called for mass protest. What will that achieve?
Correct. He's called for mass protests, which are basically demonstrations guaranteed in the Constitution of Kenya 2010. And he said that on that specific day, they will be having peaceful and armed protests, which they are entitled to have. So here is a day which was supposed to have been a national holiday for purposes of having elections, but more than half of the country is in lockdown.
Right.
There are military trucks and police vehicles, heavily armed, security forces.
But these are precautionary measures because of potential violence that could happen and has happened in the past. I'm just wondering what your views are on how you get the country out of this impasse, how you move the country forward into some sort of leadership that can make decisions.
You see, unfortunately, we are not going to get there because those in power have already said they are not going to speak to anyone, that they can only speak to someone after October 26th, which means that they want to go through some ritual, however illegitimate it is, so as to give themselves power. Then they can sit down in a position of power and authority. So
do you think the elections should be postponed then?
There will be no election, as far as I'm concerned. You see, when people talk about elections, it's not just any election that was ordered by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said the election must be in strict adherence to the law and the Constitution. And what we are going to have are not just not credible. They don't adhere to the laws and the Constitution.
Right. Dr. Miguna, Kenyan lawyer there, former senior advisor to Raila Odinga during his premiership. Raila Odinga, of course, pulled out of the rerun of the elections, which we're not very clear what will happen. It's supposed to be in a week's time. Big question marks on whether or not it will happen and what will happen if it does or doesn't.
20 of the hour, Newsday, BBC World Service to the US now, and the latest controversy involving Donald Trump. You could say the latest controversy involving Donald Trump and bereaved parents. The president has been accused of being disrespectful towards the widow of Sergeant David Johnson, one of 4 US servicemen who were killed earlier this month on operations in Niger. At issue is the way that he's reported to have spoken during a condolence call to the family of the dead man.
Talking about the fallen soldier, it's alleged that he said, quote, "I'm sure he knew what he was signing up for. but it still hurts, end quote. A version of events backed by a Democratic Congresswoman, Frederica Wilson, who was with the family during the call, but President Trump has hit back and he says the claims are untrue.
Well, they're called Gold Star parents, Gold Star families in America if they've lost a loved one on service. Christina Ayube is a Gold Star mum. She lost her son, who was a soldier. She gave us her take on these events.
It would be one thing if this was one or two things, missteps in a presidency, but unfortunately, this is one in a very, very long line of missteps that just keeps continually happening. It's just appalling. You don't say something like that, and I get that he is an awkward guy, but his staff should have been competent enough to know that maybe that phrasing was not good for him. I'm a Gold Star mom myself, and I've been in the position where these people are in, and it's just not something you want to hear from someone who's supposedly the commander and consoler of your country. You want to hear things like, as a grateful nation, we're very sorry for your loss and we thank you for his service. We know these soldiers know what they're going into. My son knew what he was going into. We don't need to be reminded of that on the way to receive the body. If he said what he said to Mrs. Johnson, I probably would have hung up on him. It's not the thing you say to someone who's going to receive their dead loved one.
Christina Ayube, Gold Star mum, talking to us earlier, sort of brings it back, doesn't it, I think? 18 minutes to the hour.
You're listening to Newsday. Scientists in Germany say the number of flying insects has decreased sharply and that there are now only a quarter of the number that existed 30 years ago. The insects that include butterflies, bees and moths play a vital role in pollinating plants and are also a food source for birds.
Now, there was no reason given by the study, but the nature reserves where it took place were surrounded by agricultural land, which suggests that farmers' use of pesticides could be to blame. The lead researcher is Hans de Kroon.
In the modern agricultural landscape, for insects, it's a hostile environment. It's a desert, if not worse. And the decline there has been well documented. The big surprise is that it is also happening in adjacent nature reserves, for which we thought so far that they were doing quite well. We should be far more cautious with our insects than we have been even in the recent past. What we need to do is to encourage and bring into effect all sorts of measures that we know are profitable for insects.
Ecological Armageddon, it's being called. Check your windscreens. Apparently it is noticeable that there are fewer bugs than there were when you were a kid.
Now to Zanzibar, and it may not be the first place you'd think would be blighted by a mental health epidemic, but that's the hidden side of the semi-autonomous region of Tanzania, where rates of mental disorders have increased sharply in recent years, largely because of drug abuse. Nicola Kelly reports, and a warning, some listeners might find parts.
On the East African island of Zanzibar, a throng of patients gather in a damp, dilapidated hall to undergo a remarkable form of psychological therapy. The treatment is an age-old spiritual practice trusted by swathes of the population here: exorcism. It begins slowly, gently, with the sheikh, a chiselled, brooding man, invoking the evil spirits in the minds of his congregation. Steady, circular recitations. But within moments, the crowd become frenzied, frantic, surging forward like a wave of tiny, convulsing bodies rising and crashing. Young girls and their mothers are thrown against walls. Others are clawing at the floor, pupils dilated, mouths distended. The girl next to me now is about 15 years old, and she's come forward from the very back of the room towards the sheikh and is reaching out for him and thrashing around on the floor with her fists clenched, attempting to beat the spirit out of her and shouting at it.
I had anxiety and depression, and I'm using tablets in London, but when I come in this place, I feel like I don't need tablets.
So are you more convinced that traditional medicine like this or healing?
Effective. Very, very effective.
More so than medication in the West?
Yeah.
Ashura is a pious, bespectacled lady. She has travelled more than 7,000 kilometres here to her birthland in search of relief from acute mental suffering. For the thousands of mentally ill patients like Ashura, spiritual healing is their last glimmer of hope. Where it becomes contentious is the profound impact it has on scientific medicine, which is largely distrusted and poorly resourced. Showing me around the island's one mental health facility is this man, Dr. Abdul Wakil Idris, Zanzibar's first and only local psychiatrist. Mental health, he says, is consistently pushed down the government's list of priorities.
Mental health facilities here were the dumping ground for unwanted staff from other hospitals. Anybody who is problematic, send him to the mental hospital. It's pretty disappointing. Mostly people thought of the asylum. Take them, lock them up, possibly drug them so that they sleep. That's it.
And that's what lies at the heart of Zanzibar's mental health crisis: drugs.
The narcotic drugs are within this envelope. So this contains drugs which has been already taken for analysis.
What drugs have you got in that envelope?
This is heroin.
According to the UN's Office for Drugs and Crime, more than 400 kilograms of narcotics have been trafficked over Zanzibar's fluid borders in the past 5 years. And that, says Omar Makame, Chief Inspector of the Anti-Drugs Unit, has led to a steep rise in the number of people affected by mental disorders.
These drugs affect mind. They have been affected mentally. So they act the way those people of unsound mind act. They are acting abnormally. They are just roaming about the street. Sometimes it's go too far.
But while progress on these issues may be slow, there is still one man working against the odds in spite of it all. Dr. Abdul Wakil Idris. Are you hopeful for the future of people with mental health issues in Zanzibar?
Not so much. I'll be lying to myself to say that in the next 20 years things will be rosier. It's a small place. We know each other. And if somebody really has a problem and I'm faced with that, then I can't say no. I can't leave it. Can't come out.
And you can hear more on this story, Zanzibar's Spirits and Psychiatry, in this week's assignment here on the BBC World Service. That was Nicola Kelly reporting.
11 minutes to the hour. Time for the sport. Matthew Kenyon.
And who's looking good after the latest round of matches in the European Champions League? Paris Saint-Germain, 3 wins out of 3 after a thumping win over Anderlecht. Barcelona, same after a good win over Olympiacos. And Manchester United, also 3 wins out of 3 after their 1-0 victory over Benfica last night. They're doing it the hard way, according to coach.
It is to ignore the players that are injured.
Now, rightly or wrongly, that was instantly interpreted as a dig at the manager of his former club Chelsea, Antonio Conte, whose team gave up a 2-0 lead at home to Roma in a match which eventually finished 3-3 last night. They're still top of their pool, but Conte wasn't happy with the dropped points, and he wasn't happy with what Mourinho had to say either, as our reporter at the game, Alistair Bruce Ball, explained.
Antonio Conte has spoken a fair bit this season about his squad being stretched by the demands on them, but he responded sharply when told that it was thought Jose Mourinho's comments about some managers always crying about injuries were directed towards him. Conte said Mourinho should concentrate on his own team and not talk about others, and it was something he'd also noticed last season. It clearly irks him, but Chelsea's director of communications stepped in to prevent him saying something he might come to regret. But his initial reaction does also seem to back up that suspicion that Conte's not entirely happy with the way everything is going at Chelsea this season.
Elsewhere today, Algeria's new coach is going to be their former player Rabah Madjer, the man who scored the winning goal for Porto in the 1987 European Cup final and one of Algeria's greatest ever players. He had the role last until 2002. He becomes their fifth coach in 3 years, with the job of getting them through to the Africa Cup of Nations in 2019, after, of course, they failed to qualify for the World Cup in Russia. Talking of World Cups, the Under-17 tournament continues in India. Mali will play Ghana in the quarterfinals after the Black Starlets beat Niger 2-0 in their round of 16 match. The other quarterfinals, Spain against Iran, USA versus England, and Germany against Brazil. And in baseball, the New York Yankees recorded a 5-0 win over Houston Astros. The Yankees are now 3-2 up in the best-of-7 series and head to Houston for Game 6, where they will have a chance to clinch a first World Series berth since 2009. That, of course, in the American League. In the National League, which will provide the other team contesting the World Series, Chicago Cubs, the overall champions last year, held on just with a 3-2 win over LA Dodgers, but Dodgers still lead 3-1 in their best-of-7 series.
Matthew, many thanks. Now, in what would be or could be a world's first, Ukraine is considering setting up what is called a corruption court. Later today, politicians will be discussing plans to lift their own immunity from prosecution to help curb widespread fraud in the country. On Tuesday, thousands rallied outside Parliament in support of the bill. I've been speaking to one politician leading the calls for a change, Sergei Lyshenko.
Yeah, I agree that corruption is a big story, not only for South Africa, but for Ukraine as well. And we need a corruption court to have a resolution of anti-corruption investigation conducted by newly established anti-corruption bureau. And there are a big agenda of anti-corruption changes in Ukraine.
Why not normal courts?
Because the system is corrupt, and to start cleaning the house, we need to establish an anti-corruption court, which is going to be the beginning of a big anti-corruption fight in Ukraine.
That's quite a damning stance. What you're saying implicitly there is that Ukrainian politicians are corrupt, the judicial system is corrupt, so you need something completely independent from both of them.
Yeah, I agree. And what we have in reality, we have that corruption is a problem for Ukraine during decades, but only now, since revolution of dignity happened 3 years ago, the start of anti-corruption fight happened, and now to complete this establishment of anti-corruption institutions, we need an anti-corruption court. This is the reason why thousands of Ukrainians came out in the beginning of this week on the streets
Mr. Lyshenko,
to protest.
Why would the thousands of Ukrainians that rallied outside the parliament believe you or any other politician when they say that, you know, they're giving up immunity, we're open for corruption courts? And how do you guarantee the independence and the credibility of that court?
We have experience when we established the Anti-Corruption Bureau and law enforcement agency. Idea is to make nomination process open for public, totally transparent, and to involve different stakeholders to make this nomination process clean without any external influence of political clans. So the idea is to have completely different system, which we have now in our regular judicial system.
Someone listening might say there's no chance that, you know, MPs, members of parliament, politicians will give up their immunity, own immunity, to be open to anti-corruption courts. That sounds implausible.